Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Freestyle GOAT Challenge, which is being held in the city of Wiesenhaus in the country of Germany. Now, yesterday, the former world champion Magnus Carlsen got off to a bit of a slow start, but the current world chess champion Ding Liren got off to an even worse start by scoring a whopping 0 points out of 4 games. That means that Ding Liren, the current world champion, went 0 for 4. So today, to start off with round number 5, we have the matchup between the two world champions, the current world champion Ding Liren and the former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. So let's jump right into the action. So Ding Liren playing with the white piece in round number 5 against Magnus Carlsen. He's on 0 out of 4, while Magnus is on 2 points out of 4 or an even score. So once again, this of course is Fischer random chess, where you arrange all the pieces on the back row on different squares, as I have clarified before, and I'll clarify once again. This was a variant, maybe not originally invented by Bobby Fischer, but it is attributed to him. And when people come with names like Freestyle Challenge, or you call it Chess 9LX or other things, I feel like we are not giving due credit to the former American world chess champion. Nonetheless, let's jump into the action. So all the pieces arranged on the back rank, it's a little bit different, but Ding decides to start out with the move F4 here. Now, one of the things with Fischer random, as I mentioned before, is normally if you have queens and rooks on the D or E file, you try to push pawns in the center. Beyond that, the general theme that I've found is you're trying to open up diagonals for the bishops, because the bishops do tend to be on somewhat different squares than they are in normal chess. So we get F4 here from Ding, and I think Ding's idea is very simple. What he would love to do is play something like F4 and G3, and this way the two Bs are completely open on the long diagonals. So we get F4, F5. Now we get C4 being played here by Ding. Magnus plays C6 here, and C6 is an important move because what Magnus has the option of doing is playing C5 and playing the mirror, or playing C6, so that if white plays D4, then you can always play D5, and we get the sort of locked up pawn structure in the center of the board. So we get C6 from Magnus, and now Ding plays G3, opening up both of D's diagonals. We get this move G6 being played here by Magnus, and now Magnus as well has opened up both of his diagonals for his bishops in addition. So we get the move knight to D3 here from Ding. Now we get knight D6 from Magnus, and we're already starting to see why perhaps C4 and C6, the difference between the two moves. When Magnus plays knight d6 here, he's attacking his pawn on c4 with the bishop and the knight, whereas if we were to go back here just to illustrate it, after c5, g3, g6, knight d3, here black would be in some trouble because the pawn on c5 is already under attack. So back to the game, Magnus's pawn on c6 is very safe, no pawn to be captured on c5, whereas Ding's pawn on c4 is already a big target. So the game continues with knight to e3. Now we get this move knight to e6, and we have knight to e5, and we get g5 here from Magnus. Now the reason Magnus plays g5 is he's trying to undermine the classic connect 4 here with the pawn to the knight, but also if white takes the pawn on g5, it's a spaghetti-o time. You lose the knight on e5, and with it you will lose the game. So here Ding plays c5. Magnus now takes on f4, we get takes, and Magnus takes back on f4. If Magnus were to move the knight away from d6, potentially white could maybe try to capture this pawn at f5, or even play something like knight d3 back, guarding the pawn first, followed by capturing this pawn. So Magnus goes knight takes f4, and now Ding plays this move d4 here. Important move, because if Ding were to take on d6 after bishop takes knight, black is actually a little bit better here, because if white were to take the pawn at f5, black can end up a pawn in this position. And if white were to take on e7 after takes, knight takes f5 and queen f6, suddenly this white king on b1 is very, very weak here. This diagonal is completely open. If you move the knight, for example, black can play something like bishop takes b2 to win the pawn. If you play something like queen c2, there's h5 with ideas like bishop to h7, and suddenly black's bishops here in the middle of the board and on the edge are very, very powerful. So Ding goes d4 here, trying to guard his knight on e5 while still pressuring the knight on d6 and hoping to recapture on f5 down the road. Magnus plays knight to f7, we get the swap, and now we get this move knight takes f5. Here Magnus plays bishop g6, and Ding goes e4, and now Magnus plays the very aggressive move d5, trying to shatter the center of the board. Now it's a very tricky situation to judge here, because as I look at the position, you'll notice one big issue for white in the long term, which is that there's this bishop on h1 that's very, very passive behind the pawn. So even though white kind of has a little bit of a center, the bishop on h1 isn't really in the game here, and it becomes much more pronounced when Ding plays n peasant with pawn takes pawn, because after pawn takes pawn, now this bishop is permanently behind this pawn on e4. The diagonal is closed. Black has bishops on both the diagonals, pressuring both the pawn on d4 and the knight on f5 as well. And for that reason, black, I think here, I don't know if black's better necessarily, but I feel like it's a little bit easier to play. And in a rapid game of chess, it's very, very important that you have easier moves because then you can pressure your opponent on the clock. So Ding goes bishop to f2 here, trying to activate his dark square B, put it on g3 and pressure this pawn on d6 and this knight on f4. Magnus now goes queen to f8, targeting the knight on f5 while still guarding this pawn on d6. Ding decides to go queen g4, and this is the start of going in a wrong direction. Computer here thinks that white should play queen c2 with the idea that after black plays a move like rook to e8, white can go rook to f1, and let's say black were to castle, white can now go bishop g3, pressuring the knight. And if black were to play something like takes, for example, you get some position like bishop f5, there's bishop g3 here to pressure the knight on f4 and the bishop on f5. Now again, this is not easy to find, and you can't really be critical of the players because the position is so new and fresh, and there are going to be a lot of blunders in 960 chess versus regular chess. Nonetheless, when Ding plays queen g4, Magnus now takes on f5, we get queen takes, and we get the trade, and now this move castles played here by Magnus. And the reason that Magnus is better now after castling the king is that both these pawns on f5 and d4 are very, very weak, and the bishops just aren't active. The bishop on f2 is guarding the pawn on d4, but the other bishop is staring at a scope of pawns, so white effectively has two weaknesses and two very bum bishops, for lack of a better way of putting it, and it's already very tricky to play. So here Ding goes bishop e4, which is a mistake. Computer is screaming for d5 here because after black were to say take on d5, white can go rook g1, king f7, and then takes, and castle to the queen side. And now black is still better, but white has pretty decent drawing chances. Instead, we get the move bishop to e4, which now allows Magnus to create the pawn chain of 3, meaning these pawns are permanent weaknesses now, and it's very, very unlikely that white will be able to survive the game. Ding plays bishop to c2 here, and now Magnus goes knight to h3. A nice move here, pressuring the bishop on f2, but much more importantly, stopping white from going rook to g1 and checking the king on the g8 square. We get rook to f1, we get takes, and now bishop takes d4, and just like that, Magnus Carlsen is up a pawn here. He's got 5 pawns versus 4, and while it's opposite color bishops here, the problem is Magnus has these pawns connected, so Magnus can try to start pushing p in the center of the board. Pawn on f5 is a permanent weakness, and you can already tell that Ding Laurent is on his way to losing a 5th game in a row and going 0-5 in the Freestyle GOAT Challenge. So we get rook to g2, king f7, Ding castles, we get rook to g8 here, nice little tickle, rook to e2 played. If Ding were to take the rook, you're probably thinking, wait, takes, rook takes d4. Magnus Carlsen hung a bishop, he's going to lose the game. But no, Magnus Carlsen did not blunder. If rook takes, rook is played, you throw in the check in between, king moves, you take the rook, now there's no free bishop to be captured, and you're going to infiltrate with rook g2, creating the kebab on the second rank and winning the game in short order. So we get rook to e2 from Ding, Magnus goes bishop f6, we get rook e1, rook to g4 played, rook e6, and now we get rook to g2, pressuring everything here on the second rank. Ding goes rook e2, and now we get the swap, and Magnus plays rook g8. Now what Magnus knows here already is that all endgames are going to be close to winning for him just because he has a 4-on-2 in the center of the board, and Ding decides to go bishop d3, we get rook g4, king c2, rook h4, a nice move to permanently pressure this pawn on h2, and also tie this rook down to defending the pawn on the square. Rook cannot ever move away, because if you go like rook e6, I'll simply take the pawn, and you will lose the game. So we get the move b3 here. Now Magnus goes bishop e7, intending to play bishop d6 and win this pawn on h2. Ding goes rook f2, we get bishop to c5, and now Ding Laurent resigns the game. Perhaps you could say it's a little bit premature here to resign, but it's understandable why. And the reason that Ding resigns is twofold. First of all, he knows that he's going to lose a second pawn on h2, but besides losing the second pawn, it's the pawn structure here which makes it very, very difficult. The reason for that is that because black has 4-on-2 in the center, let's say white goes here, even if you're able to reach some endgame like this, for example, black will go king f6, c5, and in the long term here, just to illustrate it, black can create 2 connected pawns in the center of the board, and because of the 2 connected pawns together marching down here, it's just going to be losing no matter what. And so Ding realizes that in this position here, after bishop c5, even if he gets to a bishops of opposite color endgame, because they're the 4 pawns connected and black will be able to push them all up the board, it's simply hopeless. So Ding Laurent loses this game. This moves him down to 0 out of 5, a very, very tough loss. Magnus wins the game, and he now is on 3 out of 5. Now, one of the great things in this tournament is that it's featuring many different players, and we're now going to take a look at some players whose games we haven't really covered. Now, Vincent Keymer, whose game we covered yesterday, won a very beautiful last round game against Ding to take the lead in the tournament, and going into this critical matchup in the 6th round against Alireza Firouzja, he was the sole leader. But if Alireza can beat Vincent, Alireza will actually overtake Vincent and become the sole leader of the event. So round number 6, Alireza with the white pieces, Vincent Keymer with the black pieces, and we get this move c4. Now, one thing with Fischer Random, you got to be very, very careful. And once again, it's another situation where if you aren't careful and you hang a pawn, you just lose a rook and most likely the game. So we get c4. c5 played here by Vincent. Now both players have the option to potentially capture the pawns on h2 and h7 respectively. Alireza does capture, Vincent captures, we get knight to g3, and now we have this move bishop takes g1 being played by Alireza. Here we get queen takes g1, and now we have this very interesting move f6. Now if I were playing here, most likely I'd play the natural move, which is knight g6 here to be a human, and after takes we have the classic mirror on the wall. The position is identical here and probably fairly balanced, but Vincent decides instead to play f6 here, trying to claim a bit of the center and activate his knight to the f7 square. Alireza goes b3, we get b6 here. Now both players have opened up the long diagonals for the two b's. We got this move e4, e5 played, and now we have knight 1 to e2. Here Vincent goes knight to e7, and now we get f4 being played, f4 played by Alireza, and Vincent plays the move d6. Now computer thinks this is fairly balanced here. I tend to agree, but the one issue here for Vincent is that his knight is not getting developed in time. So if we go back, for example, you go back just to illustrate, you say you get the same position with knight 6 b3 b6 takes something like e4 e5 knight e2 knight e7. In this position, white could never play f4 to try and break the structure, because if you ever go f4, black can take back here because he's guarding the pawn with the knight. So one big drawback when we get to this position here is that after f4, the knight guards the pawn, and Vincent has not developed this knight to g6 yet. So I think that not playing the mirror and avoiding knight g6 was actually a bit of a mistake, but it's much easier to see now further down the road than it would have been at the time. So here we get d6 being played by Vincent. Alireza castles, we get knight to f7. Finally Alireza captures the rook, because if he doesn't capture the rook after rook to h8, black suddenly is winning the game. So we get the takes, and now we get queen to e3. Vincent castles here, and we have this move rook to h1 being played. Now again, the big issue here, and I would say this at the top level, is not an issue that applies at lower levels, but the big issue for Vincent here is that Alireza has claimed this open h file, and the knight on f7 is a very passive piece. It's guarding the pawns in the center, but it's not pressuring anything, whereas the knight on g6, for example, say I could just set it back on g6, would put pressure on this pawn right away, and white would have to make a decision. So the combination of the open h file for the rook with the passive knight on f7 means that Alireza has come out of the opening with a bit of an advantage. So we get g6 here from Vincent. Alireza plays knight to c3. Now we get f5 being played, trying to rip open the long diagonal and also potentially open up the g file for the queen as well. Here Alireza plays knight to d5. And now already here it's clear that white has obtained an advantage, and the reason white hasn't obtained an advantage is black is going to have to trade something on d5 here. So when we get bishop takes knight, e takes being played, this bishop on a1 is on a fantastically open diagonal here. If black were to play e4, you'll notice bishop has all kinds of scope. There's bishop f6 here, there's even d3 to undermine the pawn structure in the center of the board, and it's very, very hard to play. If black were to play knight takes knight after pawn takes, you're still in trouble because white is threatening to win the pawn on e5. And if you go e4 here, if we just look at this logically, a position like, let's just say this, for example, bishop on 8 is terrible. This pawn chain of 4 just blunts any threats to the bishop. White can claim the h file with double stack here, just a sample line, something like this, and queen h7, and black is in all kinds of trouble here. So that's why Vincent decides to take with the bishop. He's hoping here that after pawn takes now and rook to e8, that without this bishop, white sure white has the pawn chain, but there's no passive bishop, and if the center opens, maybe black can use it. So we get knight to e2 from Alireza. Vincent plays king to b7. We get this move f takes e5. We get d takes e5, and now Alireza plays the move queen to f3. The big problem for black here is that white has the connect 4, and white can try to push his pass pawn down the road, in addition with this weak pawn on e5 and the open h file. So Vincent plays knight to c8. Alireza goes knight to f4, and this is a very, very tricky move. And you're probably thinking, what the heck is knight to f4 here? The reason Alireza goes knight to f4 is that if white were to play d6 right away, black can play e4, closing the diagonal and the check, and after queen to g3, knight takes d6. Suddenly these knights guard each other. Black is up a pawn in the middle of the board, and black is doing great. So when Alireza goes knight to f4, first point is that if black does not take this horse, say you play knight d6, now white can get this knight to e6, and we get the classic connect 5 combined with a great outpost for the knight on e6, and the computer thinks that white is close to winning. And when e takes f4, Vincent inevitably captures the horse. Now d6 is playable, and the reason is there's no pawn to e4 to cover this diagonal. So without the pawn to e4, it gets very tricky. Now rook to e4 is played here. If black were to move the king, for example, there's d7, forking the knight and the rook, and after say rook d8, here white can actually play this very nasty move, rook to h8, threatening to win the queen, because after you take the rook, there's bishop e5, and it's simply checkmate of the black king. So Vincent plays rook to e4 as expected. We get d7, and now we have this move king to c7. Now computer thinks that after this very unusual move king to a6, black is still a little bit better, but let's be honest, these are human players playing Fisher random chess, which already is outside their comfort zone, and expecting just a very quiet move like king a6 is simply not realistic. So we get king to c7. Alireza plays d3 here, attacking the rook on e4, forcing it to move. We get rook to e7, and now pawn takes, knight is played, and Alireza under promotes it to a horse. Here Vincent captures with the queen. If you were to capture with the king, there's queen to a8, which wins the queen on g8. So we get queen takes knight, bishop to f6 played here by Alireza. We get rook to d7, rook to h7 being played, and it's clear that Alireza is playing here with huge momentum and initiative. And on top of that, Vincent is very, very low on time here with 1 minute versus Alireza's 7 minutes. So we get the move g5 being played here, and this is a move that I don't particularly like. Computer wants queen to f8, and after queen takes f4, knight d6, black is desperately trying to reach an endgame here so that white doesn't have an attack, whereas g5 is Vincent trying to say, okay, I'm going to keep my extra pawn here, and hopefully you can't attack the king. So Alireza goes queen to e2, a great move as white now controls both of the open files here. The rook on h7, it controls the open h file while pressuring from the side, and the queen on e2 controls the open e file as well. So we get the move g4 being played here by Vincent. This is a move that I think is played because of the great time pressure he's under, and this move effectively loses the game because now Alireza plays the move queen to e6. Now computer actually thinks rook takes f7 I think is winning, so after takes, queen e5, king b7, and queen d5, you're winning the rook on f7, and it's tricky to play. But Alireza understands here that in this position, because of Vincent's time situation with 12 seconds, sometimes it's easier to go for the attack rather than trying to play something that is technically correct, because in this situation when queen to e6 is played, it's very, very difficult to come up with moves. So Vincent plays knight to d6 here, which loses the game because now Alireza plays rook to h8, and the bishop guards the rook here. Queen has to move, and after queen to b7 is played, there's now this great move bishop to e5, and suddenly the knight and the king are in a lot of trouble here, as is the pawn on f4. And Vincent decides to play the move queen to c6. If he were to play a move like f3, for example, white can trade on d6, and after takes, rook to h7, not rook to h7, sorry, I'm losing my mind. After, no, I thought, wait, no, rook h7, king c6, queen to f5, white is still winning the game because the queen guards the rook, and there is a threat of queen to e4 checkmate. Nonetheless, we get queen to c6 being played here, and now we have bishop takes f4 from Alireza, and now the game is effectively over, and it's over because black cannot push the f pawn and try to create counterplay here, and the knight on d6 is going to be lost in a couple of moves. We get b5, Alireza decides to take. Now you could play king b7, for example, but after rook to h6 here, you probably have to go back to guard the knight. If you move the knight, you lose the queen. If you take the pawn, you lose the rook. And so after king c7, white can simply take the pawn, take g4, go back, and this pin on d6 of the knight by the bishop on f4 will be deadly in the long run. So we get b5, desperation, c takes b5 played by Alireza. We get queen takes g2, and now bishop takes d6 is played. Vincent captures. We get rook to h7 check, and now Vincent Keymer resigns the game in view of the fact that after you move the king, you lose the rook. If you go backwards, there's actually a ladder mate with queen g8, rook d8, and queen takes d8, and it's simply game over. So Vincent resigns this game. This means that after 6 rounds, now Alireza jumps into the lead as we go into the 7th and final round of the Freestyle GOAT Challenge and the qualification stage of the tournament. Now in round 7 there were definitely some interesting games, but I didn't really see anything that stood out in a way that I felt like recapping. So I'm going to give you guys the final standings as we head out of the qualification stage and into the knockout stage tomorrow. Now the standings are that Norbek Abdus with a last round win over Magnus Carlsen finishes in first place with 5.5. Second is Vincent Keymer with 5. Third is Fabiano Caruana with 4.5. Fourth is Ali Reza with 4. Fifth is Magnus Carlsen with 3.5 points out of 7. Sixth is Gukesh with 3. Levana Roni with 2 points. And last but not least, the current world champion Ding Liren gets what to me felt like a little bit of like a respectful draw from Ali Reza. He gave Ding a draw in the 7th and final game, so Ding does not have to go through the ignominy of finishing on 0 points out of 7. He gets 1 draw to finish on half out of 7. Now, I'm not sure what the format is for the knockout stage, but I believe it will be games of classical chess, which means 90 minutes for the first 40 moves, and then 30 minutes after that. I believe the pairing should be Noterbeck versus Ding, Keymer versus Aronian, Fabiano versus Gukesh, and Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen if the seedings go the way I think they do, but we don't know for sure. So we will obviously wait to get the exact pairings and everything else, but that is going to be my recap today for the second day of the Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge, which is being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. Tomorrow, of course, I'll be back to do another recap of the games that are played there. And last but not least, as always, if you guys do like my content here on YouTube, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back soon with some more great recaps from the Fischer Random 960 event being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. See you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.